My name is Turlough McConnell, a native of Buncrana, County Donegal, living in New York for the last 40 plus years. And in Donegal, where I grew up, there was a famine memory, but there wasn't an awful lot of famine-related talk. And it was the kind of traditional silence around the famine to a great degree. The only difference was that as a child, my grandmother owned a property that at one point belonged to the Bishop of Derry and Donegal, whose name was Edward McGinn, Bishop Edward McGinn. And that property came into my family probably around the early 1900s. And it was a beautiful thatched cottage right in town, with a walled garden that was really quite beautiful. And my uncle, my grandmother's son, and his family lived on the property. And I would spend my childhood, I had 6 boy cousins there and 1 girl cousin, and I would spend my time with my cousins. In the middle of the garden, there was a cast iron pot, a large famine pot. And we knew it was the famine pot, but we didn't really know much more beyond that. But it was part of what was left from the time when the home was owned by Bishop McGinn, which, by the way, was a splendid house with, even though it was a thatched cottage, it had French windows leading out to the garden, and it had oil paintings on the hall and in the bedrooms. So it was quite a beautiful place, very enchanting. So, roll forward many years later, I'm in New York, as I am, and I'm doing a lot of work on the restoration of St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is the main cathedral of New York and one of the great cathedrals of America. And I'm doing an exhibition on the history of the cathedral. And I knew that the man who had planned the cathedral was an Ulster man, whose name was John Hughes. And Archbishop Hughes, he was the 4th Archbishop of New York, and he became Archbishop in his 40s. So Hughes had planned the cathedral, and my job at that point, about 4 or 5 years ago, was to gather information on Hughes and tell his story, and tell the story of the building of the cathedral, which I did subsequently with an exhibition that was shown at the Consulate of Ireland in New York in time of the restoration, just before Pope Francis came to reopen the cathedral after the restoration. While I was working on Hughes' story, and I was doing a lot of research at both the archives for Hughes were mostly at the archives of the Archdiocese of New York and up at Dunwoody, and also the archives up at Columbia University. But when I was up at the archives in New York at the Archdiocese, the archivist there, a young woman, Kate Ferry, one day I was there and she said, "Turlough, would you be interested in seeing a letter I have from a Bishop McGinn in Donegal?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I'd be very interested in seeing that letter." And she brought a letter to me that was Bishop McGinn writing to Archbishop Hughes and thanking Archbishop Hughes and the people of New York for sending money so they could buy Indian meal to put in that famine pot that was still in the garden of McGinn Cottage back in Donegal. So for me, it was the whole story had come full circle. And then I realized that the famine is still such a part of even the life of New Yorkers, as well as those of us from Donegal, from Buncrana, from Derry, who full knowledge of the famine and the implication of the famine in the north is not really documented. The great famine historian Christine Keneally speaks about famine in Belfast and Derry, but we only know Derry as a port of embarkation to other places, England and Canada, North America. But bringing that story around and anchoring the story with Edward McGinn and Buncrana was so important to me for several reasons. One reason that Bishop McGinn also built the church, the main parish church in Buncrana, which according to penal laws could only be built 1 mile outside of the town. And he completed that church, which stands today, a beautiful church, in 1848 at the height of the famine. And he also died. He contracted disease and died that same year. So I'm just very pleased that in working on the story of one great Ulsterman, John Hughes, I come across the story of another equally great Ulsterman, and that's Edward McGinn. So thank you for the opportunity to tell the story.